Welcome to episode 54 of No Rares Required, Azorius Crafty Flyers. Every week I do an in-depth guide to a specific archetype, and this week I'm going to attempt to get my podcast set up on multiple platforms. So look for me on Spotify, Podbean, Castbox, Audible, Google, and Apple Podcasts. This is a draft skeleton limited to 15 commons, 7 uncommons, and 1 rare. And since some of you might be listening audio only, we'll walk through each card as well as some alternatives. My overall takeaway is focus on flyers. I think they are a little bit better than just strictly going for the mid-range craft. But you do still want a couple of craft cards, specifically ones that craft into great mid-range threats if you aren't able to get things done in the air. And don't be afraid of 1-drops. They have performed quite well. I don't recommend going below 17 lands despite the low curve, just because your mid-range crafts are usually 6 or more to trigger and are definitely worth flipping. So remember to hit like and subscribe for daily Magic the Gathering content, and let's begin. Alte Cloud Guard is my top performing white common. You get a 3/2 flyer for 3 and a white that enters the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature token. And there are some interesting artifact synergies. So not only do you get a flyer, but you're also helping with the general go wide. Also, Water Wind Scout is kind of doing a similar thing. For 2 and a blue, you get a 2/2 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you create a map token. So you get 2 rectangles in 1. And there's a lot of that going on in the set. And you do want to leverage as many rectangles as you possibly can to gain an advantage on your opponent. But popping the map token to do an explorer and make this into a 3/3 flyer has been quite impressive. Or you can use the map token later to animate it, as we'll get into when we cover the uncommons. And then Miner's Guidewing, I've also been very impressed with. You get a 1/1 Flying Vigilance, and when it dies, target creature you control explores. So right there, 3 commons that all have flying. Fantastic. Petrify has been impressive. One thing to note is that black has not been performing particularly well. And I think that's because the spot removal doesn't work very well with the discover mechanic. So if your opponent is playing, and just cards that create multiple things like Cloud Guard, right? So like the more that your opponent is playing cards that create 2 rectangles, if you're using a single card to destroy one of those rectangles, eventually your opponent is just going to outvalue you. So since black is typically the best at single point removal, I'm not surprised that it's kind of struggling. But I have been impressed with Petrify. It's cheap enough, and really in this strategy, you're just trying to get rid of anything that is either outracing you on the ground or is blocking your path in the air. So being able to remove your opponent's flyers for cheap has been quite effective. We've got, as well as Oaken Siren, I've been really impressed with. You get a 1/2 Vigilance flyer for 1 and a blue that can tap to give you a blue mana, but you can only spend that mana to cast artifact spells or activate the ability of an artifact source. And the craft abilities in blue-white are activated abilities, so you can use this to help pay for craft. You can use this to help play your mini artifacts, including itself. If you get multiple copies, you can tap to bring out these guys, and then it helps you ramp into your 6-cost craft so that you can do it much sooner than turn 6. So I've been impressed that these have been going relatively late, too. I had one draft where I was able to get 6 copies. Definitely recommend. I've also been really impressed with Tinker's Tote. It is a artifact for 2 and a white that enters the battlefield, creating 2 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens. And once again, in a set that really cares about how many rectangles you have, this is 3 rectangles in 1 card, right? And you also have the ability to tap white and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. And because craft works with artifacts in your graveyard, you can sacrifice this and then craft with it from the graveyard and gain the 3 life. Or you can use it to animate. It just gives you a lot of options. And then also the 2/1/1 blockers chump really well. So if you're racing in the air and you're trying to slow their tempo down on the ground, Tinker's Tote has been really good at doing just that. I've also been impressed with Inverted Iceberg. You get a when it enters the battlefield, you mill a card, then draw a card. You don't really care too much about the mill you know, if you mill an artifact or something, you can use it later to craft, but you're not really doing the descend strategy. But, you know, you still get to cycle this and create an artifact, which you can have synergies with. And then, but what I really like with it is that with Oaken Siren, you can craft this much, you know, for 6, you can use your Oaken Siren to kind of ramp to that cost and flip this into the 6/6, and I forgot to put the picture up on it. But you get a 6/6 that when it enters the battle, or when it attacks, you can tap one of your opponent's things, or you can untap it. So it's kind of got pseudo vigilance. And then I've been very, very impressed with Cogwork Wrestler. You get a 1/2 flash artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. And so this is like a combat trick that also leaves a rectangle behind that you can use later. And it single-handedly eats a 3/1. So I'm still surprised to see these going relatively late. I imagine that will change soon. But for the time being, I've been able to get multiple copies, and I've absolutely loved including this card. And then Unlucky Drop is one that, like, early on, its stats were just off the charts. It was doing incredibly well, and it has since dropped, which we kind of, you know, I would expect, right? It's still useful, though, because so you're not strictly a tempo deck. You're kind of a tempo mid-range deck, right? And so if you're more towards the mid-range, then the less you'll want the Unlucky Drop, because bouncing something that has a good ETB is terrible, and you know, like, if they just draw it and play it again, it doesn't really get rid of the threat. But if it's a problematic blocker, you can get rid of it for 2 turns, and it is still decent as far as tempo goes. So think about how aggressive your deck is, and whether or not you want to include Unlucky Drop. But I generally have found myself including one because they are available quite late. It's quite easy to pick up. Orasa Puzzle Door is an artifact for 1 blue that has a colorless tap it, sacrifice it, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand and the other into your graveyard. And this is kind of like Sleight of Hand from Wilds of Eldraine, where you would run Sleight of Hand if you wanted to get the cycle through your deck, smooth out your land draws, and increase the spell count in your graveyard. So this is kind of like, well, you're doing the same thing, except for you're increasing the amount of artifacts in your graveyard, which is handy for craft. So this one is kind of a filler card. You can definitely go without it, but I have been impressed with it for smoothing out your tempo plays and then giving you a mid-range item that you can use to craft has been quite useful. And Waylaying Pirates is one that, like, you know, I think it fits better in the tempo strategy of Izzet, which I will cover tomorrow. But I've been impressed with this as long as you have enough artifacts. So if you control an artifact, tap target artifact or creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And so this one, you have plenty of artifacts in this archetype, and you can use this to remove one of your opponent's blockers while also increasing a threat. So similarly, though, if you're more towards mid-range than you are tempo, then you don't want this card as much. So you kind of have to decide, like, am I trying to stall out and win through crafting, or am I trying to win in the air? And the more flyers that you have, then the better pressure that you can put on your opponent, and the more likely that you'll want to remove or slow your opponent's aggressive clock down, and then Waylaying Pirates becomes better. If you're just trying to gum everything up and then win through flipping one of your artifact craft cards, then this is a little bit less impressive, but I still have enjoyed it. And then we've got Brackish Blunder for 1 and a blue, and this one is especially even further into the tempo side of things. If you are doing the mid-range craft strategy, and that's really where you're, like, heavily leaning into, then you don't want Brackish Blunder, because similar to Unlucky Drop, you just bounce something and it comes back, right? But if you're winning through early pressure, and especially early on in the set, people haven't been warranting having the 1-drops and 2-drops. So you can have a tempo side to this, right? So kind of try to think about the pace of your deck again, and decide whether or not to run the Brackish Blunder. I do think I prefer the Unlucky Drop to Brackish Blunder in this archetype, because it does work a little bit better with the mid-range strategy, but is still a decent option for some interaction. And the hidden cave lands, I think we need to be addressed in each archetype, because there are some archetypes that want it and some archetypes that don't. So if you are going, I'm going to win by turn 5, turn 6, I'm going heavy into the tempo strategy, I'm just going to beat you up with flyers, then I feel less good about the tap lands. And because you want to start your pressure on turn 1 if you can, and certainly by turn 2, and tempo can't afford to stumble, right? If you have to take a turn off of your curve because you only have a tap land and it hurts your early plays, it's so detrimental to tempo strategies. But blue-white's not necessarily strictly a tempo deck like blue-red pirates. And so I've found running 1 or 2 copies to actually be pretty useful. You don't need to do a turn 1 flyer. If you do, it's great. Usually you can find some turn where you can get these in without it being too detrimental, and then you can start using your lands in the mid-game to outvalue your opponent, because being able to tap 4 and the color of the land and sacrificing it to discover 4 just makes your card into a threat. And then my last note for the commons is Captivating Cave. I don't think that the set is particularly good to splashing. I do think that I've seen some people like Isaiah do a very good job at splashing for Jeskai and being like blue, white, red, and or being like strict like red, white, splash blue for the uncommon, things like that. So if you're finding yourself tempted to splash, the one way that I do think works relatively well for Jeskai for white, blue, red is Captivating Cave. Because you have so many flyers in the archetype, later you can tap 4 and tap it to sacrifice it to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, activate only as a sorcery, and then you can tap 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So it's like Crystal Grotto, where you can use it to cast something, but it's going to add 1 mana to its cost. So generally, I like these a little bit more when you have a cheaper thing that you're trying to splash, like in a Braid in your blue-white deck or something like that. But I haven't really found myself using this, but I thought it would, if that's what your heart desires, then it's a good option. Now for the uncommons. We have 1 mythic level uncommon, 100%. This thing is absolutely busted. Drafted if you have the opportunity, is Zoetic Glyph. You get a 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura that enchants an artifact, and the enchanted artifact becomes a 5/4 in addition to its other types. And then when it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, discover 3. And so you can make a map token into a 5/4. You can make a Oaken Siren into a 5/4 flying vigilance for 3. And then when they remove it, then they have to exile the enchantment specifically to prevent you from getting an additional card out of this. And it's not just a draw when it dies, it can also replace itself by getting a creature onto the battlefield. So the more creature heavy you are, I think the Discover mechanic, I've found Discover to work better when you have more creatures than spells. So there isn't really a spell slinger archetype that I've found yet that really wants to be all spells. And so this works quite well as long as you can hit a decent threat that costs 3 or less. And then we've got Spyglass Siren, and this one's close to a mythic level uncommon. It might be. We'll see in a couple of weeks if it holds. But a 1/1 flyer for 1 blue that when it enters the battlefield creates a map token has been absolutely amazing, right? In a set that cares about 2 cards in 1, this one starts it off on turn 1, and then you have an evasive threat that you can grow with the map token if you want to into a 2/2 flyer on turn 2 and just start beating up your opponent. We've got Clay-Fired Bricks, which I've been very impressed with, and so it helps you smooth your curve. You can, it helps you find your lands. You search your library for a basic land or plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and you gain 2 life. And this one has been just like an absolute game winner in the mid-range strategy. Less so in tempo because you'd rather be playing a threat on turn 2. But if it does kind of move into mid-range, and I think a tempo strategy that has a backup plan of a mid-range is pretty good, right? So if you're trying to win through flyers and you just can't quite hack it, it's nice to be able to stabilize against your opponent's aggression by gaining the life, finding the land to continue to hit into 6 and 7. 6 and 7 lands can be tricky to hit sometimes. And this thing crafts with an artifact into Cosmian Kiln, which is a artifact that creates 2 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens, and then gives all of the creatures you control +1/+1. And with combining this with other cards that like Cloud Guard and Totes, now those 1/1 tokens that enter are 2/2s, and once this card is flipped, it is very hard for your opponent to win the mid-range game. I've also been very impressed with Staunch Crewmate, which is a 2/1 for 1 and a blue, and I've been surprised to see these still going relatively late. Since you only need about 9 or so, 9 is usually what I shoot for, but if you hit like 11, that's great. I would guess that Sirkovitz is probably going to have a magic numbers on the ideal number that you need to get this to work, but I've not had a problem with this. You get to reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and if you reveal an artifact or a pirate card, you get to put it into your hand. And so you get a 2/1 threat for 2 that then helps you outvalue your opponent by giving you additional cards, and has been absolutely awesome in Azorius, as well as in Is It Pirates. I've also been very impressed with the Ruin Lurker Bat. You get a 1/1 flying lifelink for 1, and then at the beginning of your instep, if you descended this turn, scry 1. And this is just similar to the Guide Wing and to the Spyglass Siren, is just like, you can start pressuring your opponent on turn 1, which just is a very hard thing for your opponent to deal with, other than playing flyers like Oaken Siren in response. And I think this is partly why green has struggled a little bit, because the good reach creatures aren't until like the Colossal Dactyl on turn 4. You get a 4/5 reach, and then blue-white just plays a Petrify on it and keeps the pressure coming, right? So it races incredibly well, has a lot of really great options at 1 and 2 for flying, and is probably the reason why it's the top performing set, top performing archetype in the set so far. And it's also not a complicated strategy, right? Like, pick up cards that have flying. Easy. Alright, we've got spring-loaded saw blades, which I've been impressed with. This one, it more so when you are going towards the mid-range threat, because if you are beating your opponent down heavily at the beginning, then the likelihood that they are attacking you becomes less, and then they're less likely to have a tapped creature that this deals 5 to. But if you're switching into the mid-range and they're starting to pressure you, or you're trying to recover from your opponent's pressure, or remove an attacker that's racing you, then this has been very useful. And so it's removal that then also turns into an artifact on the board that you can use to animate with Zoetic Glyph. But then you can also craft it into a 5/5 vehicle. And it has a crew 1, which with like totes and things like that has not been a problem to crew. And then you can tap 2 untapped artifacts or to crew it if you want to use just like your map tokens instead of your board. And it's a lot of really good mid-range pressure. Market Gnome is also something that I think goes in the Azorius craft deck. You get a 0/3, which is really good at gumming up all of the 2/2s and 2/3s in the set while you race in the air. And then later, when you start getting into that mid-range, I'm going to start crafting and outvaluing you. This is a perfect item to use because it draws a card and gains 1 life, even if it's exiled, if you're using it to craft. And then if it dies without craft, it's also card neutral. You gain 1 life and draw a card. So it's very, very good in this archetype specifically. Duskrose Reliquary is definitely worth a mention. It is decent removal. You do have a lot of fodder between your map tokens, your 1/1s off of totes, that sacrificing an artifact or creature has not been that much of a price to pay for being able to remove your opponent's biggest threat, and it has Ward 2, so if they do have some sort of artifact hate in their hand, like in a Braid, they at least have to pay 4 to remove this and get their creature back. And it exiles the artifact or creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So you can also hit, if you're in the mirror match, you can remove your opponent's busted artifacts that they've crafted into. Lodestone Needle and its what it flips into, Guidestone Compass, has been very impressive. You can use it in the tempo strategy to remove a blocker for 2 or 3 turns, and then craft for 2 and a blue into Guidestone Compass, and this one just eventually outvalues your opponent by triggering an Explorer every single turn. You do have to tap 1 colorless and tap it, But putting this on a flyer, giving a flyer +1/+1 each turn, also smoothing your land draws, getting rid of the cards that you don't want into your graveyard, has been quite impressive. And now for the rares. Unstable Glyph Bridge, which turns into Sand Swirl, or crafts into Sand Swirl Wanderglyph. One of the things that I've noticed about this set is that it is rather princely. There are a lot of good rares, and because of the single point removal not working very well, because of the 2 rectangles cards, the Discover cards, Cloud Guard, things like that, it allows the rare. There's weird tension, right? Because you want removal for your opponent's crazy bombs, but your removal also doesn't work very well against some of the other cards in the set. And so this kind of sets it up, along with the pace of the set, to be kind of a princely format. And we've seen some really strong rares. The rares have been doing quite well. So Unstable Glyph Bridge is a Wrath, basically, for 3 and a double pip white. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, for each player, choose a creature with power 2 or less that player controls, then destroy all creatures except creatures chosen this way. So this can be a one-sided board wipe if you are the only one that has a power 2 or less creature. But even if you're just using it as a Wrath, and then switching it in the mid-game to craft with an artifact for 3 double pip white into the Sand Swirl Wanderglyph, you get a 5/3 flyer. Whenever an opponent casts a spell during their turn, they can't attack you or planeswalkers you control this turn. And then each opponent who attacked you or a planeswalker you control this turn can't cast spells. So it prohibits what your opponent's doing, on top of already being just an amazing Wrath, right? So top performing rare. Definitely, definitely take it if you open it up and pack one, pick one. Thousand Moon Smithy has also been just absolutely impressive. You get an artifact, legendary artifact for 2 and double pip white. When it enters the battlefield, create a white gnome soldier artifact creature token, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of artifacts and/or creatures you control. So if you go like turn 1 creature, turn 2 creature, turn 3 totes, which is 3 rectangles in 1, you can play down the Thousand Moon Smithy and get like a 6/6 on turn 4, and then have plenty of options the following turn at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. So you can't flip this the turn it comes down, but the following turn, you can then tap 5 things on your board, untapped artifacts and/or creatures, and transform this into a land. It will transform into an untapped land if you don't tap it itself. So the dream is having 5 things from Thousand Moon Smithy, which turn 1, turn 2, totes, and then the 6/6 that you made gives you enough that you don't actually have to tap this. And the reason why that's important is because when you transform it, it's still going to be in the state that it was before. So if you tap it, it will be tapped when it turns into the land. But if you can manage to do that without tapping it, you can then on turn 5 use it to cast an artifact or a creature spell and create another gnome soldier artifact creature token that is a 7/7, and it just continues to grow. And it absolutely overwhelms your opponent. It can be so demoralizing to play against, and absolutely so much fun to play when it's on your side. And then we've got the Sanguin Evangelist, which we've started to see this in constructed play, and it's impressive in limited as well. So when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 black creature token with a black bat creature token with flying, and so it's already 2 cards in 1, which is really good in the set. And then when it dies, it also creates a 1/1. So you kind of get 3 cards in 1. But the important part is that it's the go wide pump, right? So when it has Battle Cry, when this creature attacks, each other creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So if you have a really go wide board off of playing several totes, they suddenly all become 2/1s, and your opponent just can't help it but get overwhelmed and swarmed by all of your attackers, and has been a very impressive card as long as you are going wide. And then we've got Warden of the Inner Sky, and this is a 1/2 for 1, and as long as it has 3 or more counters on it, it has flying and vigilance, and you can put counters on it by tapping 3 untapped artifacts and/or creatures you control to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it triggers a scry. So not only is this helping you go wide off of using, or go big off of using your map tokens and your 1/1s, but it's also helping smooth your future draws. It has been a top performing rare. And now for the blue rares, Subterranean Schooner is ridiculous. You get a 3/4 vehicle for 2, and when it attacks target creature that crewed it, this turn explores, and the crew cost is 1. So you use a measly little 1/1 token to crew this into your 3/4 that can start attacking on turn 3, and then the 1/1 explores, smoothing your land draws, smoothing your card draws, and if you hit a non-land card, becoming a 2/2, right? So the pressure on this has been unreal, and so the one downside with this set is that like sometimes people play a bomb you just don't have an answer to, and Subterranean Schooner is in that category. It can just win games single-handedly. And we've got a Pakal, First Among Equals, which is a 1/5 for 2 and a blue. At the beginning of each player's instep, if an artifact entered the battlefield under your control this turn, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. And this works quite well. You've got an artifact theme going on in Azorius, and a 1/5 body blocks a lot of the pressure on the ground. So if you're trying to slow your opponent's clock down, this does quite well. And then as you transition into the mid-range game, the triggering additional card draw is just going to eventually outvalue your opponent. The one downside with this is that if it goes super late, if the game becomes ultra grindy, you can end up milling yourself with this card. So I have seen that come up a couple times. And then we've got Kite Sail Larcenist, and this card has been very impressive. And I also like it just from a design perspective, because you kind of have to ask yourself, like, if the thing that you're removing from your opponent is worth giving them a treasure token, or if it's not, right? But being able to remove your opponent's biggest threat and make it into a treasure token is usually something that's pretty, is decent to do. Maybe just don't do it on like a 1/1 token. But you also get a 2/3 flying ward. Ward 1 creature, which is just good. The stat blocks is a lot of really good pressure. Most of the flyers in the sets are 1/1s or 1/2s, some 2/2s, so it matches up quite nicely against those. And you can also choose to do it to your own. You can choose a permanent, like if you want to change one of your map tokens or one of your 1/1s off of Totes into a treasure so that you can get in, ramp up to your craft artifacts, has been quite useful. And then Restless Anchorage has been very impressive. We got the rest of the tap lands, or the man lands, and so this one, the white-blue one, it enters the battlefield tapped, it taps for white or blue, and then for a white and a blue, it turns into a 2/3 bird creature with flying, and whenever it attacks, create a map token. So in a set that really cares about how many rectangles do you have on board, a 2/3 flyer has been very impressive, and not to mention, it's also a flyer. Right? Even if this was a 2/3 that created a map token, I still think it would be pretty good, but the fact that it has flying sends it over the top. And we have but one mythic. It's a little early, these first episodes that I do, we still have yet to explore the set in its entirety, and mythics are a little bit slower to get data on and to play against. And I've come up against Resplendent Angel, and it single-handedly beat me. Especially if you get the 3 double pip white, it just seals the deal, right? You get a 3/3 flyer for 1 double pip white. At the beginning of each instep, if you gained 5 or more life this turn, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. And then you can tap 3 double pip white until end of turn. Resplendent Angel gets +2/+2 and gains lifelink. So you're attacking in with a 5/5 flying lifelink that is difficult to deal with in the first place, and then if it does connect with anything, right, even if it's blocked, you still gain the 5 life, which then creates a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance, and just eventually overwhelms your opponent. So the first week, I like to do a double episode, so look for Is It Pirates tomorrow, November 22nd. And if you're watching this in preparation for the Arena Open over the weekend, I wish you all of the luck. This could be a tricky pool for sealed because it is very high synergy, and green feels dependent on some key uncommons, and black has been underperforming. So if you found this episode to be helpful, please help support my dream by taking a moment to hit like and subscribe and leaving a comment below. I really appreciate it. And if you want to go above and beyond, you can click join to become a YouTube member or subscribe on my Patreon. Or you can just come by and say hi when I'm streaming live on Twitch. Links are in the description below. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. Good luck with your games and future trophies. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you tomorrow.